Hello and good late afternoon or early evening. Thank you very much for tuning in to tonight's live stream. My name is Joe Chris and I'm from the not-for-profit social enterprise called Opus Independence. Tonight's live stream is part of a series of live streams and articles we've been running looking at Sheffield's radical roots and how to bounce forward after the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm very excited to introduce tonight's event, which is going to be all about anti-racism and challenging systemic inequalities. I'm going to now introduce our host for tonight's live stream and the author of a recent Now Then article featuring this topic that you're going to hear much more about shortly. Please welcome Maryam.
Thanks, Joe, and thank you for joining us, everyone. My name's Maryam, and I'm a PhD researcher in English Lit that looks at trauma and racial injustice. And this article in the Radical Roots series, like Joe said, looks at Sheffield's relationship to race and to issues that organizers, anti-racist organizers might have in Sheffield when they're trying to change things. So she's not here yet, but hopefully she'll join us at some point. But for now, we've got Annalisa and Ishah, who are going to introduce themselves. And if you could just tell us a little bit about where you're from, and then we'll get cracking.
Hi, I'm Annalisa, and I'm the founder of Our Mel. I've lived in Sheffield 11 years, came originally for a uni/boyfriend, ended up staying, and yeah, I do lots of work around Sheffield in sort of various different sectors, mainly in the VCS, and yeah, a lot on anti-racism.
Hi, I'm Ishah. I'm originally from Sheffield, so born in Sheffield but grew up in Rotherham. So spent a lot of my life growing up in both town and city. I left Sheffield for quite a long time, for about 13, 14 years, actually longer than that, because of work and for travel. And I've worked in the voluntary sector for over 18 years now. My specialisms have been around gender-based violence and migrant rights. And lots of the places I've worked have been very much rooted in sort of Black feminist activism and things. So there's quite a lot of anti-racism work that's been involved in the work that I've been doing. I've also worked as an immigration advisor in London. Done a lot of work in detention centres and prisons, supporting women to get them out, stopping deportations, so quite mixed. I returned to Sheffield a few years ago and continued working in the voluntary sector. And then last year, mid-pandemic, decided to leave the sector altogether and set up my own project called the Women of Colour Azadi Collective, which is a space for women of colour, Black and brown women to come together, where we can heal from trauma, but also find ways to organise and liberate ourselves from structural inequality.
Thanks, guys. And when this article came out last week, there was, I don't want to say mini scandal to do with some Windrush funding that was given to, I believe it's a majority white organization, and that's kind of exactly some of the things that the three of us were talking about. So I feel like that's a good place to start, because I think sometimes when we're putting these pieces together or you're speaking to other people about it, there's a tendency to be like, well, what is the problem? But actually, for so many of us, we live in the problem and there isn't necessarily a need to articulate it. So it kind of just felt a bit typical and expected that the Sheffield City Council would choose to give Windrush funding in the context of what Windrush is to this country and the Home Office and deportations. So, obvious question, I'm assuming you two weren't surprised by that either.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about it, seeing as though I was one of the people who joined the collective to write a letter. I found out about it a couple of weeks ago. Got a call from a friend of mine who also works in the sector, and she was like, "Have you seen this? Have you seen the Windrush funding?" And I was like, "No." So had a look at it, and I'll name the organisation Ignite Imaginations. Had a look at their website, and I was like, "What's this about?" And then you know, started chatting to a couple of other people, and we were all just like, no, we didn't know they were given the funding. Where's this money come from? And there was just lots of questions that we had around sort of this funding money. And then when we approached, so there was a group of us, I think there was about 8 or 9, wrote a joint letter to Ignite Imaginations, because as a white organisation, and they are predominantly white, let's not beat around the bush on that, they shouldn't have accepted that money, you know. And their response back to us was that the council had chosen them to have some of the money. And when I say some, it's really only a tiny percent off the actual 15,000, but they were chosen because they were seen as an organisation that had the capacity to deliver this project. So basically, and that is like, obviously I'm not saying it word for word, but that is predominantly what she said. So basically the council had decided that none of the black art organisations in the sector were capable of carrying out this project. So that obviously led a lot more questions, also questions around who decided where that money went to. And it all goes back to the council. The council put a bid in 2 years ago for £15,000, which is part of the Windrush Fund. And they then, obviously COVID happened. So the money was kind of backdated slightly because that money should have been spent last year. They then appointed Faith Star as an organisation to choose 5 organisations to give that money to. There's lots of questions around that, because there's questions around the processing, about who decides where that money goes to. And the organisation who that money was appointed to, it was actually termed as Windrush / Black History Month funding. So there's many questions, but it all goes back to the council. The council are complicit in upholding anti-racism. Ignite, being a white organisation, are also complicit in accepting that money. So there's been a couple of emails back and forth. Ignite then, obviously due to social media pressure, there was me tweeting and a couple of other people, then decided, and obviously our letter, then decided that they were going to give the council back some of that money, set up an advisory board and various other things. But I mean, like, come on, like, this is the problem. Like, and I'm exhausted. Like, and I'll be quite frank, my mum died last Monday, right? So this article came out on the Thursday. The Ignite thing happened on the same day, the Thursday. I was exhausted. I'm dealing with the bereavement, and then I've got all this stuff going on about a white organisation accepting Windrush Fund, and I'm just like, what the hell is wrong with Sheffield? Like, honestly. So I think, you know, this is a really good starting place. I think that there's obviously lots of conversations that have happened over the last years from George Floyd, but to be perfectly honest with you, I don't really see much action or much movement. And the mere fact that Ignite accepted that money, the mere fact that the council decided that a white organisation was going to accept some of that money, you know, proof is in the pudding, really.
Yeah, and I hear everything that Annalisa's saying there, because I became aware of this recently as well. And I heard rumblings of something happening a couple of weeks back, Annalisa, as you mentioned, but didn't quite know what's happening. And then it kind of became official. And I think Annalisa's absolutely right. You know, this is so systematic of all the issues in Sheffield, about Sheffield's leadership and the problems within the council and those that hold positions of power, where in this instance, there was absolutely no reason that a white-led organisation should have been awarded that funding. It's really offensive, and it's insulting to all the incredible black-led projects and black artists that are based in Sheffield. We are really blessed in Sheffield that we have so many amazing black individuals, black-led organisations that do such incredible work that centre the voices of black people. And for that funding to have been awarded to a white-led organisation is really astonishing. It's beyond disappointing. And I think it just reflects so much about the issues within Sheffield, and how unequal those structures are. So Sheffield likes to see itself as being, you know, a very nice white liberal city, but it's in absolute denial about the levels of racism here. It doesn't understand what structural racism is. And actually what happened with this Windrush Fund is that it just, you know, very clearly highlights what structural racism looks like in practice. I mean, it was just absolutely saddening for me as an outsider looking in and thinking, Sheffield Council have done it again.
Yeah.
And, you know, this isn't the first time they've done things like this. I know this is specific for the Windrush Fund. But Sheffield Council has a bit of a history of awarding funds and grants to white-led organisations that speak on behalf of or do work for Black and brown communities. You can't do that. The best people who are best placed to speak about their own stories are people with their own lived experiences. It should have been people from, you know, the Black communities who are of Caribbean heritage that should have been awarded that funding. Nobody else would have been best placed to do that. And when we have organisations in Sheffield that apparently, you know, are BME organisations, I know there are issues around terminology, but that's the language that they use. But those organisations are managed and led by white people. Mm. What do white people know about the needs and lived experiences of Black and brown people? So to me, this is just something else that Sheffield have done. And I think what concerned me about when I was hearing about this was there just seemed to be a real lack of transparency around due diligence and processes, if there was any at all. And Annalisa's absolutely right. Who are the decision makers? Yeah. Who are the people deciding who gets to be awarded funding? There seems to be no transparency there whatsoever. And I think that's really problematic. There seems to be a lot of gatekeeping that happens within Sheffield. And I don't think it's just the council. I think the council are very problematic in themselves, but I think also it's the voluntary sector. Yeah. I think it's all the statutory services. I think it's everywhere within Sheffield.
I think it's also interesting that both of you mention capacity, because I think there's this idea in white structures that only other white organizations are a safe pair of hands that can be trusted with this, that can be trusted to do the work of, and we can't even call it the work of anti-racism because it's blatantly just not. If you're handing this money out repeatedly to white organizations. And I think it's one of those things where I think sometimes people have the idea of, oh, we're picking the best person for the job. But if you don't have the opportunities for people, you can't know that you're picking the best person for the job. If ever people are clearly not on the same footing when they're trying to break into this. How do you feel? I think, Annalisa, you've already touched on it a little bit, but when there are things like this that have social media backlash, or some things that are in the news, so whether it's Windrush or the George Floyd protest that happened last summer, in your experience, in your work, how is that sat alongside the desire from institutions like the council to change something, to provide the funding in the first place? Do you think it's something which kind of ebbs and flows as things are in the news? Because obviously for a lot of the communities that this is for, it's not a news topic, it's people's lives.
Yeah, 100%. I do think that it ebbs and flows. I think when we look at, we'll take the protests last year, compare that to 2016, the Black Lives Matter protests of 2016, and how the council responded. I was one of the organisers of the Black Lives Matter march in 2016, and the council then weren't really that interested at all. Scroll forward 4 years and they decide to put a purple flag on the town building. Like, for what? To signify whatever it was meant to signify for Black Lives Matter, you know? And I just think things like that are just so symbolic. I mean, absolutely nothing at all. And clearly it means nothing, because then they hand out Windrush funding. And like, I don't think people I don't think they even grasp the gravity of that. They handed out Windrush funding to a white organisation. Not just that, they positioned the Windrush funding as Black History Month funding. So they didn't even position it. And whether that was the council, or that's the council, like, lack of due diligence and ability to make those decisions transparent. Like, I trawled through their website to find out, because I went on this whole investigative trawl about, okay, so where's this money gone? They were allocated £15,000. There is nothing on their website. There was not anything on their website last Thursday on where this money had gone. And there is no transparency in terms of sort of you know, giving it out to the groups that they gave it out to, or what was the application process, where was the advertising, where was the marketing, where was the comms around all of this? There was nothing, you know. And so I think that when I look at the council and all their work that they're trying to do with this Race Equality Commission, which I'm in very much doubt about, I have no hopes or aspirations for it. I think we don't need 12 months or whatever it is to compile a couple of reports together and say, okay, this is how all these institutions are racist. We as Black and brown people know how these institutions are racist. We work in these institutions. We work in the sector. It doesn't take a report to state that. We're doing this report for white people, not for ourselves. Yeah. So I just have a lot of doubts, and yeah, I'm interested to see how our council moves forward. We did get so just going back to the Windrush, we did get a really good response from Rebecca Maddox, who leads on the culture, and who obviously works in at the council, and she did, you know, come back to us with a response, a perfectly good response, I thought, on the, you know, stating that it was anti-racism, blah blah blah, and then CCing the director of culture into it all. We've not yet had any further conversations on that with the council, so I'm interested to see how this now transpires, but I don't have much hope.
With these kind of things, could either of you talk a little bit about how, so you've got Windrush, which itself is an incredibly violent thing that happened to British people, and it's all to do with conditional citizenship and people dying abroad, away from their families, away from their homes. How can we have conversations about the trauma of that? Because it's one thing to have Windrush itself, and then to have funding that like ebbs and flows. And then you've got city councils who are allocating the funding to what they think is the safest pair of hands, but is actually the most inept pair of hands, and often the pair of hands that do the harm. So is there anything that the two of you can add in terms of understanding like the depth of the violence that these kind of moments cause?
I think for me, it's just a continuation of that violence, you know, and I think it's, in this case, in a Sheffield City Council, again, showing that they're not interested in looking at the root causes of what the issues are, which is them. It's white supremacy. You know, the fact that they awarded this fund to a white-led organisation without even considering Black people, you know, is absolutely appalling. And it just shows how little this council values and honours the lived experiences of Black people and Black people's expertise and skills. And I think that just adds to the trauma. We're talking about people, you know, and I say this as a brown person, so I'm not specifically talking about being Black here, but, you know, even as a brown person as well, you know, we're constantly marginalised. We're constantly told, oh, we will support you, you know, we will be anti-racist, but they're just words. The actions do not, you know, mean anything at all, because as Annalisa said, you know, there's this kind of performative allyship that takes place, and certain things are said, but nothing's actually done. If this council actually wanted to really critique itself and actually really make a change, it would mean it having to do a lot of work internally, which it's clearly unwilling to do. It's happy to get an external person and a group of people to review race equality in Sheffield. Fine, that's great. But then what else? Because if that review can only ever make recommendations, there's no point. That there needs to be accountability. And I think with the council, there's no accountability whatsoever. I think sadly it isn't just the council. I've seen it in the voluntary sector, and it's the reason I left the voluntary sector, because of racism. And when you look at who the leaders of the statutory and voluntary sector are, you will see the same several names cropping up over and over and over again. So not only are these people upholding white supremacy and structural racism, they continue to harm, you know, because actually they're unwilling to let go of any power. They're unwilling to share any power with Black and brown folk within the city, because they think they know best. That's racism. So for me, it's just this is a continuation of violence against Black and brown people. But I think Sheffield, being the city that it is, just wouldn't view itself as that because it's so neoliberalist. It really believes itself as being this, city, the first city of sanctuary, that they can do no harm here, that there's this history of Sheffield having a very radical root in working class politics, which it does have. But even that is very skewed. It's not an honest history that's been taught. There are no Black and brown voices within that. And I think it's really interesting how this Windrush was also deemed as being part of Black History Month as well. I mean, it's just a case of, well, we've got everything for white people and we're good to support white people, and for any Black and brown people, we'll just dump it under one thing. There's absolutely no consideration being taken around dealing with doing this work sensitively. I don't really know. So I'm constantly amazed at how backwards Sheffield is. And like I said, I returned to Sheffield after many years of being away. This is the place where I grew up. This is where I used to hang out. This is where place I used to go to gigs as a teenager. And I went away, came back after, I think it was about 16 years, I came back, honestly believing that things might have changed. It hasn't. I still see the same people that I recognized from 16 years ago. They're just a bit older, and now they hold positions of power. And it seems like all their white friends are also with them holding positions of power. I don't see Black and brown faces there. And I think if you do see any Black and brown people, they're the people that have been put into positions where actually they're not going to be rocking the boat in any kind of way. They're also going to be upholding and being complicit in this structural inequality. And Sheffield's happy with that.
Yeah. And I think that's the problem, isn't it? Is that people who are safe, people who don't, who toe the line, people who don't want to rock the boat, and I'm talking about Black and brown people here, these are the people that are put into those positions because they're safe people for the white people to come to and be like, is this okay? And that's exactly what happened with the council. The council awarded the money to a brown organisation, Windrush funding to a brown organisation, who then decided what groups those were going to. There's been no transparency over that. There wasn't even any transparency in terms of the applications coming in to that brown organisation to decide how much money. I heard from one of the groups who was awarded the money that the money was just literally put into their bank account. They didn't know how much money they'd applied for. The money was put into their bank account, but the application wasn't advertised. So like the whole process around that money is absolutely disgusting. And I think and you're talking about trauma, but this is trauma. This is added trauma. Like our ancestors fought and I'm going to swear, fucking hard for our lives, our freedom. And then, do you know what I mean? The council then go and just trample over it all just because they have to spend it by a certain date. And I just think it's absolutely appalling. And I think that unless that we have these conversations, and you know what's mad about it, I got a DM from somebody who I really highly respect. She's a PhD researcher, and she used to live in Sheffield. She now lives in Birmingham. She's doing a lot of work on sort of tracking Black and brown collectives across the UK. And feminist collectives. And she DM'd me and she was like, I can't believe you're having to deal with this while you're going through a bereavement. I wouldn't have heard about this if you hadn't posted on Twitter. And I was like, exactly. Nobody would have heard about this. This Windrush money would have just disappeared. No transparency. What upsets me is that I'm seeing like loads of other cities putting out all their Windrush events and all this, that. What has Sheffield got? We've got nothing apart from this little archive thing that they've given the money to Ignite for, because all that money was spent back in October for Black History Month. Like, make it make sense. It's just appalling. The whole process around that funding is absolutely appalling. And I really do think the council needs to be held to account to that. I also don't think that you can give one organisation power to decide where that money goes to just because they happen to be the supporting organisation for the BEMA hub in Sheffield.
Absolutely. Like, I couldn't agree with both of you more. And I think it seems like what you're describing has so much to do with people maintaining the status quo at any cost, whether that cost is finances, people's lives, people's livelihood, anything. And people would rather do anything to maintain the status quo. And my worry here is with these kind of conversations is that there will be white people listening or reading the article who think, oh, they don't mean me because I'm a good white person who means well. And so often that meaning well is not enough. And equally, there's Black and brown people who do the work of white supremacy, who work in service of white supremacy. So just being Black and brown in itself is not going to be the thing that brings liberation or freedom or justice for anybody. And I think it's important to kind of dwell in that anger and the frustration as like a guiding principle, but also it's also overwhelming to repeatedly be in the same place again and again. Sheffield City Council are 100% going to do this again. And there will be people in there who are like, well, I'm quite well-meaning and I mean to be anti-racist, maybe in a superficial way, but nothing ever really changes. So that kind of like segues us on into our next section, which is kind of a chat about the discussions that we can have amongst communities of color where we're not trying to speak to whiteness and we're not trying to account for our existence to whiteness. So I guess some of the things that I'm thinking about are what makes it possible for you to do the kind of work that you do within your communities? What do you feel like you've needed in order to be able to do it?
I mean, there's so many things. I'm just thinking about off the top of my head. There's so many things that we need, you know. We need support, we need funding. We're not getting any of that. You know, with the Azadi Collective that I set up, I was awarded funding by Resourcing Racial Justice. And there is absolutely no way that I would have been able to set up this project if it wasn't for them, because no white funder, no council would understand the need for a project like this. They wouldn't understand what healing looks like for Black and brown women. They wouldn't understand what intersectional politics means. And I don't mean intersectional politics as a buzzword. I mean actual grassroots intersectional politics. They wouldn't understand what liberation from patriarchy and colonialism and white supremacy looks like for us. They wouldn't understand the need for Black and brown women to have spaces where we can honour our lived experiences, where we can cultivate joys, because this is also part of healing liberation work. None of that would be funded by Sheffield. No one in Sheffield would understand it. None of the leaders in Sheffield would understand that. However, if I was a white person, I can guarantee you I would be given funding for that, because it would be, oh, look at the nice white person helping the poor black and brown women. I would be seen as a saviour. But somehow as a brown woman setting up a collective with other Black and brown women, you know, I'm somehow seen as a threat instead, something that's a bit othered. And that's also racism, right? It's just our skills and expertise and our lives just aren't honoured by white folk. And I think also that's why it goes back to the Windrush Fund. You know, it's like you don't understand the expertise. You don't believe that Black people have the capabilities of doing this work. You can talk about capacity, but we're not even talking about capacity. We're talking about capabilities. You don't think Black people are capable of this. And actually what Sheffield Council are doing are, you know, they're just perpetuating white supremacy and very colonialist ideologies around racial hierarchy. So I, as a brown woman, I'm very aware that when I see the council, I see the white folk at the top. I see some brown people with them. I don't see the Black people, right? And that's been created by the white leaders. This is the same racial hierarchy that has existed forever, that white people created when we were colonized, right? And what I find concerning is that there's this divide and conquer that gets played out in Sheffield, where Black and brown people are then pitted against each other. So as brown people, we see ourselves, you know, as having closer proximity to whiteness, so we then harm Black people. Right. And then there's divisions that get created because as brown folk, we're not looking at colorism, we're not looking at the anti-blackness that exists in our communities. We think white people have given us power, so we're okay. But actually, we're also harmed by structural inequality and race, and we're really harmed by we're the people are also that, you know, were colonized and were literally starved to death. We weren't meant to survive colonialism, and we did. Right, in the same way that our Black family survived being colonized and being enslaved, right, because we resisted these things. And I think as a brown person, as a brown woman, some of the work that I also do within the collective is also holding space to have these conversations around really contentious issues about actually what do we mean by solidarity, right? And what do we mean by sort of Black feminism and anti-racism work? Because it also means that we have to hold space to have some really difficult conversations and resist divide and conquer, because that's what the white leaders are doing to us. And what I see in Sheffield is divide and conquer being played out everywhere. I've never lived and worked in such a divided city. Sheffield has got to be one of the hardest cities I have ever worked in, because white leaders seem to be going out of their way to really cause divisions amongst Black and brown folk. And I think as Black and brown people, we need to start opening our eyes to this.
Yeah.
And we need to start thinking about how do we as Black and brown people work in solidarity with each other. Also recognise the powers and privilege that exist within us, right? Like, we've all got issues within our communities. We need to hold space for that. But also we need to work in solidarity with each other. And at some point, we also need to be looking at, well, actually, who are the white people that we can work in solidarity with as well? But I don't think we're at that stage in Sheffield. I think it's literally a case of it's Black and brown people. Let's come together, because white supremacy is out there and it's harming us. And some of us are being complicit in that harm as well. There's so much going on in Sheffield. I'm constantly amazed at the things that happen in Sheffield. I really haven't come across it. And I've been, working for nearly 20 years. Particularly, like, most of that work has been in the voluntary sector. But like I said, I've had to leave it because of the racism.
And like, when you talk about sort of being pitted against one another, and that is exactly my experience. Like the work that we did with, so let's go back to 2017 when Our Mel did Melanin Fest, and the whole idea was to bring communities together, black communities of African and Caribbean descent, to create a festival that was celebrating Black History Month. But it was so hard to do that, not just because we didn't have funding, but the fact that our communities are so divided. And so it's very hard. Like, I look at, so we'll take Festival of Debate, for example. I look at Festival of Debate or any of the other white festivals, right? And like, they don't necessarily have, they don't have the type of trauma that we have in trying to put together events or let's say a festival, because we've got to get over our issues. No, we've got to try and unite our communities first, so the Black and brown communities first, and then kind of create a festival. And so it's like this added layer of trauma that I actually don't think any of the festival producers or event organizers actually understand just how hard it is for us to try and be able to put an event on. And so when I look at the work that I've done, I'm incredibly proud of myself, and I sing my own praises, because I think that we have had to, and especially as a woman, especially as a Black or brown woman in our communities, and kind of taking up this leadership position and going forth and creating, it's incredibly hard. And that we get like the brunt of whatever comments that we get back. I've had some hateful comments, and that's coming from my own communities, and so that's having to try and so you're, as a person, having to try and get over those comments, and knowing that what you're doing is trying to unite, and knowing that you're doing that without funding. It's incredibly hard. So I think it's absolutely incredible when I see people like you, Ishah, and other people, Ursula, and other people who are doing things in our community, because I know exactly how hard it is to do that, because we've got to face criticisms within our own communities, as well as obviously the white supremacist attitudes that are outside our communities.
Yeah, and I think it's difficult to sometimes think about how, when people are organising that are Black and brown folk in Sheffield, because the funding is so sparse, if sometimes you're the only event of the year happening for a particular community, you can't be everything to everyone, but that's almost like you're kind of set up to fail, because you're asked to be everything to everybody.
Yeah.
And that's no way to work, and that's not how white organizations work, because they see themselves as so neutral that they're like, oh, we're just contributing something, we're bringing one dish to the table, when other people have to be the entire table, the chairs, the food, the whole shebang, which is like a completely different kind of pressure, which, Annalisa, like you said, some organizers of festivals and events just absolutely will not understand or consider when they're thinking, what is it about this type of work that makes it easy for me to do because I think that's like can be a really fruitful question for thinking about the other things that are going on. And so Ishah, I feel like all of that ties into what you were saying about solidarity. And we've already mentioned the complicity that Black and brown people can have with white supremacy, and the colorism and the kind of the conversations that happen within communities or are hidden or a bit more internal because they don't happen on white platforms who can't see these kind of conversations. I feel like anti-Blackness is a big one of those things for brown communities, whether that's intersecting like with Muslim communities. I know that's a big thing where there's an idea of the ideal Muslim is as like light-skinned as possible, but that doesn't translate to the surveillance of white institutions who see Muslims as any kind of other. So Ishah, do you feel like what has been your, I think it's interesting that you say that Sheffield is one of the most divided places that you've ever lived. How does that, could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think for me, it's the way, it's kind of what I mentioned before, the way that communities are pitted against each other. It was interesting reading the article that you'd written and hearing what Ursula had read about, her experience of leaving London and then coming to Sheffield, and then saying that, when she went into certain parts of Sheffield, she felt like people were staring at her. There was this sense of she was a bit of an outsider. And I completely hear that, because I think that's actually being done very deliberately by Sheffield, by the leaders of Sheffield. As marginalised people, what's happened is that you have people that hold positions of power that have created these communities specifically so that they can conquer us. So there will be, this is the area where the Black people go. This is where, this is the area where the Pakistani community can go. This is where the Yemeni community, the smaller community can go. And, we're always put in the poorest areas. And then, we're then told that we're not integrating because, we just don't know how to, our culture's othered, we don't speak the same language, our food is different. And I've heard like, there's probably, I've heard this myself, right? I've heard white people tell me, oh, but you're different. But it's different with Black and Asian people, because Black people integrate, they speak our language and you don't. So your culture's a little bit othered. Like, there's that cultural racism that takes place, which is absolutely ludicrous when you think about, well, actually the racism Black people are subjected to, as if Black people somehow were seen as equals in this city to white folk. They're not, and even within sort of brown communities, I've heard white leaders go into the Pakistani community and say, oh, the Roma community are like this, or the Yemeni community, or the Somali community are like this, but you're different because you've been here for a long time. You worked in the factories. We've become the model minority in some ways. And then I've heard the same people then go to the Yemeni community and say, oh, but you're okay. It's a Pakistani community because, they're the groomers. So there's these games that get played out, and I'm not going to mention those white people's names. I feel like I should, but I don't want to get done for libel or anything. I'm going to be careful about that. But these are things that we become aware of, and then what that creates this tension between communities, because then it creates this distrust between each other, and it's divide and conquer being played out, and it's a tactic that the British have always used against us when we were colonised by them, and we need to be more aware of this. I find it really interesting that places like Firth Park and Page Hall and Darn are seen as almost like no-go areas. Yet they're the places that I feel the safest, because there aren't white folk there actually. I feel much safer in that, and actually they're the areas where I spent a lot of time growing up. Places like Firth Park, Never Edge, towards Abbeydale Lodge, not the posh bit. These were the areas where we had family and friends. These places where I felt safe. This is where the halal butchers are, where all the Afro-Caribbean shops are, where the Asian shops. It's like where you can get every vegetable that you cannot get in the supermarkets, right? But these are also places that we've been told are really unsafe and dangerous. It's like, for who? Who said they're safe and dangerous? And even things like the way that Page Hall and Firth Park, for example, have used has been quite dirty. It's like, well, that's down to the council as well, because the council don't do the bin collections and they're cleaning the way they would do in the middle of, you know, wood seats or crosspool or anything. More money is invested in middle class areas than is in working class areas. That's what it's about. But it's never talked on a class issue. You know, it's always about race. It's like, oh, well, the Asian people like this, or the Somalis like this, or the Roma community like this. And we're not even discussing where class comes into this. And yet we also know the root cause of those issues is because the council and its leaders have created this mess. But it's our fault to clear up.
Yeah, I think if you want to talk about no-go areas in Sheffield, we should talk about Charvale Road and what it feels like to walk down there with the kind of rolling, what is the word? These white shops that pop up that are like very specialized and have their place in a kind of like middle England. But if you're walking down that street as a black person, as a brown person, I think it's a very specific feeling. I can tell from your faces that both of you know exactly what I'm talking about. But I think that, to me, you could class that as a no-go area. Like, why not have a moral panic about that? And the way that people look at you when you're walking down there. Like, I live 5 minutes from there, and I've had my fill of people who, to be fair, mostly pre-pandemic, but like when I'm walking home, that are watching to see if I'm like about what I'm about to do and if I've got my own keys before I go into my own house. And I'm here by accident. I'm here because I managed to find one house that has kind of cheap rent. So it's been interesting to live here and see kind of like in the belly of the beast, because I feel like a lot of Charvale Road is what Sheffield thinks is the best of Sheffield. It's like a road that crops up on lists of like, you know, best places to move to in the UK. And yeah, it's a cool place to live. You can get nice food here, but it's not all of Sheffield, this one little strip of road.
And this is really deliberately done, you know. It happens everywhere. Unfortunately, it isn't just a Sheffield thing either, but it is a way that leaders of cities can create divisions, which is why I go back to think of we need to start working in solidarity with each other. Like, at the end of the day, I haven't been harmed by a single black person or any other brown person in Sheffield once. It's never happened to me, right? No Somali, no Yemeni person, no Syrian person, no Afro-Caribbean person has ever done me any harm, right? And yet I've been told by white folk, be careful of those people because they will do something to you. But they haven't. It's never happened. I'm in my 40s. Nothing's ever happened to me by black and brown people in Sheffield. I have been very seriously harmed and damaged by white folk, though. And yet the white people and white leaders of Sheffield are unwilling to even recognise that.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like that takes us back to the weight of experiencing racism and kind of the things that are at your back when you are trying to do this type of work. Before you even sit down, you've got so much more on your back than other organizers who claim to be doing the same work. And the process is so much easier and so much smoother for them. So I guess if we're thinking about what kind of work is done within our own communities and across communities of color that don't involve whiteness, what does that type of solidarity work look like that you've mentioned?
Is this a question for me or Annalisa?
Anybody?
I feel like I've been talking too much, Annalisa.
You go, it's fine. You go.
I think for me, like, the solidarity work is, first of all, we need to create spaces for ourselves. But also we need to be given support to create spaces, you know, for ourselves as well, which is why, you know, I set up this, the Women of Colour Azadi Collective, but I specifically wanted it for women of colour only, so black and brown women. And the reason for that was because, you know, when I've worked in the feminist, in the women's sector, in feminist organisations, some of which have been very white, and they're also very racist. So I felt marginalised in those spaces. And then I've gone into anti-racist spaces, but then the focus has always been on men. So it's almost as if, like, as women of colour, black and brown women, the racism that we're subjected to is completely dismissed. And then I see it pains me to say this, but I see my, black and brown brothers holding positions of power, causing harm to black and brown women. It's, this is why we need to have spaces just for black and brown women to come together as well, because that's what intersectionality feels like, these multiple forms of oppression that intersect all the time. That means that, we're going to white spaces, we're harmed there, we're going to spaces where the men were harmed there, and sometimes it's people within our own communities that are harming us. So for me, it's about how do we first create those spaces where actually the start point is just saying that we recognise that we're harmed. We recognise that we live in a society that is structurally unequal and actually just harms us. It really damages us. And let's heal from that. Let's talk about it. Let's look what healing looks like.
Yeah.
And then when I think about liberation work, for me, that's about, well, how do we find commonalities with each other as well? Because also where we need to hold spaces to talk about those contentious issues within our communities. So, for example, two of the workshops that I've run as part of the collective have been around anti-Blackness in the South Asian community. There need to be a space to have those discussions, right? Because if we want to do solidarity work, I can't work with my Black sisters and pretend that there isn't anti-Blackness in my own community, right? That's like white people saying, I'm an anti-racist, but I'm not prepared to look at any of the anti-Blackness within white communities. That's ridiculous. We need to be able to do that work as well. So for me, it's about how do we create that space, but also how do we find commonalities with each other? How do we connect with each other as well? Because what I also worry is that I hear a lot about people wanting to dismantle things, and absolutely structural inequality needs to be dismantled. But I'm not hearing that much about rebuilding, right? Rebuilding an alternative way of care and alternative systems for us. And I think that's what solidarity is about. But I also think solidarity building is a lot of hard work. It's very easy to call something out. It's very easy to say, well, this is racist, or this is misogynistic, or transphobic, or homophobic, etc. And that's definitely needs to happen. But also what needs to happen is we create spaces where we come together in solidarity, and we start thinking about transformative justice and what does that look like for us? What does a society that is based on equity look like for us, and how does that benefit us and everybody else actually? But that takes a lot of hard work and it takes time. And we need support also to be able to do that. But they're also the types of things that funders don't want to support, right? So when it comes to obtaining awards from grant funders or councils, etc., again, it doesn't really understand our needs. So when we talk about liberation work and solidarity, they're things that you can't measure. They're not something where you can talk about outputs and outcomes, and yet that's what white-led funders want you to measure. It's like, but actually just having a space where Black and brown women can come together and just talk about the pain that we're in, but also talk about actually how joyful we are.
Yeah.
And reconnecting with our ancestors and how powerful that makes us, because these are things that have been erased from us, right? That is so powerful, and they're things that you can't measure. I can't tell you at the beginning of a workshop how a woman's feeling, and then at the end of the workshop how she's feeling, and be able to measure that. I just know it works. So for me, that's kind of what that solidarity looks like as well, about finding commonalities. But it's long-term work, and that's the kind of thing that we just don't have the resources for. And it also means resisting divide and conquer.
Gonna say I totally agree with that, and I think that is the problem, isn't it? Is that there isn't a funding process or any type of funders apart from like the funding that you got to do your work, who would actually give us that type of funding. I think a lot of it is about, again, it's about playing safe, it's about using the right words. I remember when I first set up Our Mel, and we had to keep it sort of diversity and inclusion and kind of open to everybody kind of thing, and they're the kind of words that we used, and like that's not my heart at all. I'm very much about liberation, very much about anti-racism. But I know that for me to get anywhere back, that was 4 years ago, we had to use those words because they're the only words, because they're safe words that, you know, white people don't want to hear about their privilege. They don't want to hear about supremacy. They don't want to hear about the ways in which they uphold institutional racism. And so I think, and they're the words that need to be spoken about, but they're not the words that you're going to see on a funding application at all. And like the type of work that we do, and I think this is partly why I've kind of got a bit I'm exhausted, like I'm a bit I'd use the word demotivated as well. I can't really see the point at the minute of the work that I've been doing in terms of sort of Our Mel, because I'm like, for me to kind of progress it anywhere, I want to be doing this kind of liberation work, but I full well know that funding applications aren't going to support the work that I want to do. And so I've kind of come to this place where I'm like, okay, well, where's it going to go? I'm sick of putting events on. Like, I'm sick of doing quite a lot of stuff that I've been doing. And I'm kind of like, and it goes back to what you're saying, Ishah, about these spaces. Like, I'm so much about like having these, and we used to call it safe spaces, but I'm very much about brave spaces and about having these spaces where we can come together and have these types of conversations and look at ways in which we can then kind of move forward from it. And I think that type of work you just won't really see, because again, what's the output on it? Like, you know, there's no real, for white people, there's no real output, but for us, it means a lot just to have those type of spaces. So yeah, I don't know where to go in all honesty, but it's really, no, I think it's a great conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's so important that some of that progress can't be measured because those metrics were never created for us anyway. And they weren't created for the type of goals that we would want to strive for. And I think within the conversation of solidarity and how communities of color talk and work and live amongst each other without always turning towards whiteness, I think it's also important to think about how, for example, lots of communities of color will have problems with transphobia and homophobia, not because they are inherently transphobic or homophobic, but because society is transphobic and homophobic, and we all live within that. So I think it's interesting to think about, and not just interesting, but like vital to think about what the material reality of that is, of Black and brown people coming together to discuss these kind of issues, whether it's Islamophobia or transphobia or homophobia, but all these things that affect people within our communities, people that belong to us, people that claim us and we claim them. And I don't know what the answer is to how that translates onto like a funding format, like a voluntary sector format, where it's like this paternalistic idea of, here's a pot of funding, you take some money from the pot and then you do small community initiatives and that's all the community work, when it's not. A lot of the community work, I think, goes unspoken, and sometimes is you know, having commonality with other people, having difficult conversations with people, sometimes not being able to have those conversations, but recognizing that. I feel like there's so much other stuff around this. So what are your thoughts on work that isn't necessarily, because I know you both, I think, work or have worked in the voluntary sector, but aside from that, aside from the specific organizing that you do with the Azadi Collective or with Our Mel, what are the kind of things that sustain you? And that's a very difficult question to answer, I know, so I can give examples or like rephrase my question.
So what sustains me? Is that the question? For me, it's friendships. I've built up a solid group of friends over the last couple of years. I mean, for example, me and Ishah, we bonded actually over something a couple of years ago, and that's how we became friends. And I think for me it is that it's having an inner circle of friends who are in the same sector, who do the work, and for me to be able to like talk to them about something that I've experienced. So yeah, I'd say, and also seeing other initiatives and other groups. Like, I absolutely love that there's so many different groups in Sheffield, younger people as well, who are you know, continuing the work or having ideas and wanting to do something for Black and brown people. I think it's great. So that sustains me.
Ishah?
Yeah, I kind of concur with Annalisa with that. You know, when I think about what sustains me, it's specifically for me, it's being around Black and brown women. I feel like some of the spaces that I was in when I lived in London felt like they were really magical. I felt really powerful in those spaces because there was just this understanding of where we as Black and brown women fitted in with society. You know, they were very rooted in very global and Black feminist ideology and politics. And then I left that and came to Sheffield thinking, oh, it'd be the same over here. But no, it wasn't. It was like stepping back in time. So for me, what sustains me is being around Black and brown women, because what I find really worrying is the divisions that's been caused, particularly in Sheffield. And I think sometimes we kind of feed white supremacy by playing into that. And you understand why those divisions exist, because there's things that we need to talk about, but also building solidarity with Black women and other brown women. That's what keeps me going. You know, when I think about all the problems that I've had in my career, in my life, it's always been a core group of Black and brown women that have been there for me. I've never had that level of support from white women. And in some ways, I think white women are more dangerous than white men. That's my experience. Yeah, the sisterhood is very poor with white women. You know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done that white women need to be doing.
I think because they latch onto you as well, and they see you as some type of like, you can answer all my white privilege questions. I get that quite a lot. I did a while ago, and I was like, well, this is too much for me. Like, I'm not here to tell you if you're being a great white ally, because that's what somebody asked me to do, is to be a mentor to them on being a white ally. And I was like, well, and I think, yeah, so I mean, I'm really lucky because I've got I've got a really close friend who is white. Not to use that my best friend is white, but she is, and we've been friends for 60 years. And like for me, like having her as a, like, she's been brilliant over the, you know, the last couple of years, and being able to, we've had great discussions on race, and it's really interesting, just just how like friendships can really hold you and support you through all this. I think that's what you need, and especially when it comes to when you're talking about sort of racial trauma, when you're doing the work, it is really hard and it's draining, and yeah, you need friends.
Absolutely. And I can see that there's a question which I will read out, but I think we've already answered it. So the question was, are there any councils or institutions that Sheffield can learn from in terms of radical changes to how funding works? And my initial response to that is, it's not our job to convince the council, because otherwise, no, you'll be accounting for yourself forever. But for the second half of it, in terms of radical changes to how funding works, I think everything that you've both just described, where you look for connection and commonality and solidarity with people, that's going to come in the people that you love, the people that love you, the people that can hold you. So I feel like it's something which sometimes does feel radical in the face of everything, like under the weight of everything. It does feel a bit more radical to put aside questions of funding and of explaining yourself, to do some being or living, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that you're totally right on the first bit. It's not down to Black and brown people to convince the council or any voluntary sector or any organisation or institution in the sector of how to do funding. That is for white people to do the work, to go and figure that out themselves. And I think that's another thing as well, isn't it? A lot of us, especially in the last year, when I say us, I mean Black and brown people, are brought into this whole like, okay, how can we as an organisation be more anti-racist, or how can, and it's not down to us to do that work. So like I do participate in meetings or discussions or things like that due to my job on it, but like I keep silent because it's not down to me. So I will speak when I have to speak about something or when I feel there's a need to. But I actually think that it's not down to the Black and brown people in your organisation to decide that. It is down to the white people to make those decisions. So yeah, we don't have to convince the council of anything at all. That's down to the white people. So whatever person asks that, it's down to you. I'm presuming you're white. Either way. And I think the last half. What was the last half of that question again?
Who can Sheffield learn from in terms of radical changings to how funding works?
I would say the organisation that you got your funding from, Ishah, because I saw I remember I saw the application fund for the form for it, and I thought it was great how they were very open to what that money was meant to be for, but they were very explicit. This is for liberation, this is for anti-racism work, and there wasn't really a stipulation. I didn't think. I mean, you talk more about it because you obviously got funding, but I think for me that worked.
Yeah. I was just going back to your point, Annalisa, about, you know, and yours, Maryam, as well, about, you know, it's not our job as Black and brown folk to educate white people. It's like, it's true. But also part of me is like, yeah, but I also want to know what you're talking and what you're doing. So I kind of want to be part of it as well to some degree. Like, what are you all talking about, you white folk?
I like sitting in these discussions just to know what's going on.
But I think, you know, the biggest thing for me is that, you know, even when Black and brown people do speak up, you know, you don't listen to us anyway, white people. Like, we're not listened to, nobody hears us. So that's why I hear what Annalisa said when she says, I'm exhausted. It's like, you're speaking, Annalisa, and I can feel my body just like, I need to go to bed. I'm knackered. Like, I am so tired of having these conversations. We're not the only ones, right? And when we're in institutions, when we're talking to council, when we're that only Black and brown face in amongst a group of white folk, we're then made out to be troublemakers. We're made out to feel that, you know, it's just our lone voice. And actually, I know there's only 3 of us here. It's sad that Ursula can't be here, but we're all saying the same thing. So it can't just be one of us. Like, there's a collective trauma here, right? Mm-hmm. And white-led organisations, including the city of Sheffield, just doesn't understand that. And I think if Sheffield really wants to think about really changing, it needs to look at who's holding positions of power, right? Because there are white people there who are refusing to share power with Black and brown folk, and then they're strategically picking Black and brown folk who can uphold certain ideologies. Yeah. I don't think that's something that's unique to Sheffield Council, that I think, you know, the whole of Sheffield's like that. When you look at who are the board members of charities in Sheffield, you can go across like 10 different charities in Sheffield. You will have the same names over and over again. So it's the same people again holding positions of power. If you really want to create change, you've got to let go of that power. And I think Sheffield, sadly, the people in leadership positions are unwilling to do that. And I have completely forgotten the second part of what I was talking about because it's just ranting now.
Can I just touch on that as well? I think also there's this misidea that we have to upskill Black or brown people to do that work as well. And I'm kind of a bit like, I actually don't think we need to do a lot of that upskilling, because there's a lot of Black and brown leaders in our communities who have the skills, who have the you know, who can do this work, who can become boards of organisations, become boards of charities, and actually all they need is that space to be on that board. They don't need to be upskilled, they don't need these workshops. Like, a lot of them have that already. So I think there's this like this, I don't know, like, yeah, unbalance really as to why there aren't Black and brown people there. I just think that actually there are lots of leaders. You just need to create the space to put them there. Absolutely. And I think I hear a lot about capacity as well, or we can't, or a lot about like we can't just like move somebody out or this, that, the other. But you actually can create space. It's not difficult to create space. Like, a lot of things are put down to funding, but actually we can do that. If you really wanted to invest in something or do something, you'd put the money in to do it, to create the space to put the people there. So I really have a bit of an issue when people kind of are like, but we don't have the capacity, or we don't have the funding or the space. You do, you just don't want to do it.
Yeah, it's just
but they'd have capacity as the white folk, though. This is the thing.
Exactly,
I think it's more than that. This isn't about capacity. That's using it. It's like you just don't think Black and brown people are capable.
Yeah, exactly.
And you think that we don't have the skills. You don't honour our skills, our expertise, our lived experience. The number of times when I've sat in meetings within various organisations in the voluntary sector, but also within the council, where I am the only person of colour in a room full of white folk, and they're all talking about the lives of Black and brown folk. Who are you to be doing this? And why are the Black and brown folk not here? Right? Because, it's almost as if we're really infantilized as Black and brown people. And I think it's worse for Black people in particular.
Yeah.
I think also, I recognise the differences between Black and brown women. Like, I'm quite often perceived as being submissive, passive Asian woman. So what would I know? But then when I speak out, I suddenly become an angry brown woman, and then I become the troublemaker. For my Black sisters, I think it's even worse, because I don't even think you have the right as a Black woman to even be thought of as being passive. It's like, you're just angry, right?
You're automatically angry.
It's just like, oh, a Black woman's voice and opinion. She might have even said something, I prefer a blue crayon over a pink crayon. It's like, oh, well, she's being angry. I have the luxury of not even going to that. It takes me a bit of time before I get to that space. So there's something about the gatekeepers here. There are a lot of gatekeepers within Sheffield that just do not want to share power with Black and brown folk. I think we just need to be explicit about it. We're not viewed as being capable. We're infantilized. We are people that need to be saved from ourselves, from our communities, our horrible cultures that oppress us. And it's like, you're the ones that are causing the oppression, not my culture. Actually, you're causing more harm than anybody else. Sheffield's hard work, but also I think Sheffield likes to hide behind its niceness, because it is a very friendly city on the surface of it. There's something that keeps you grounded here as well. Yeah. And maybe for me, it's also because I have connections here. But I don't think that's completely that, because I'm aware I'm in a room with two other women that aren't Sheffielders, but you've been here for a while. There's something that makes you want to stay here. There's this hope. I also have that I want to be part of a change. I want to work with other Black and brown people to make change happen. But I think Sheffield hides behind that niceness, that neoliberalism, that we're nice white people, nice white liberal people, we can't do any harm. And then they deny racism.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I find difficult about Sheffield.
So it's interesting that you've said that, because there's a question for you, Ishah. Udit says, Sheffield is structural whiteness on steroids. Ishah, as a Londoner in the past, would you recommend leaving Sheffield for relative safety in London? I'm planning to.
Oh, that's a big question. Sheffield and London, they're just not comparable in any kind of way. I was in London for about 12 years, and I felt very at home in London. That's not to say that racism doesn't exist in London, because I definitely was subjected to racism in London, but it's different as well. I think certainly when you go into spaces in London, you will see more Black and brown people at different levels. And certainly in London, there are spaces that have been created for Black and brown people. And there are pockets of communities and collectives that exist where you feel much more safe in lots of different ways. I certainly did. But then you don't have the rolling hills of the peaks nearby. And if you want to be paying half your salary a month on a room in a rat-infested house, then go for it, yeah. There's pros and cons to all of this. I mean, I loved being in London, but it got to a point for me that I just needed to leave for various reasons. And yeah, I was getting old. London was getting too fast for me in my old age. I needed to kind of start retiring. But certainly, yeah, there are certain things that I miss in London, and I miss not having those collective Black and brown spaces, which I don't think exist in Sheffield. But as I said, I think that's something that's been deliberately to us as Black and brown people.
Yeah.
And I think we have to work harder to really come together.
Yeah. Because I think that was for me. So I regularly have a thought of going to London. Like every year, I'm like, right, I'm done with the city, I'm moving. And every year I'm like, okay, let's start applying for jobs in London. Let's have a look at what's out there. And then I'm still here 11 years later, because Sheffield has this weird hold on me, and I hate it so much because I want to leave, but I'm here. And so I think that I think what we did with Our Mel was beautiful, because the idea was to have these collectives. It was to have sort of spaces for we said it was for all, so like Black and brown, of all genders, but actually it ended up, because I'm a Black feminist, it ended up being predominantly Black women, and so the idea was to have these spaces, but the longevity and the upkeep of that is extremely hard. And like, I work a full-time job, I have 2 part-time jobs, and I freelance, and so to do that, as well as, and when I built Our Mel, just to say, when I built Our Mel, I was doing that, working a full-time job in Doncaster, and Our Mel was just like a little thing that I was kind of building. So I was exhausted and didn't have much time to kind of build up the longevity. And I think that's something we don't talk about, is we might run these things for a time, but actually if we're not sustained ourselves, and we've obviously got to pay bills, we've got to pay mortgages, whatever, then it's hard to be running these groups. And I think the beauty of Our Mel was creating something here that hadn't been done before, that you could go to London and have all these groups there. And it was nice for once not to have to go to London. Like, I'm London born. I moved, my parents moved to Milton Keynes, and then I moved to Sheffield, and like, it was beautiful not having to go to London for these types of events. It was here in our city, and that's what I love about Sheffield, is that as much as I hate the city, I love it, because we have all this space to create, we have all this space to pioneer, we have all this space to basically do whatever we want within capacity. But actually a lot of us are actually pushing those doors and being like, do you know what, I want to set this up, and I want to set that up, and I want to do this. But my question is, there isn't much sustainability in what we're doing. And so that is, for me, the where I think that actually the council, not necessarily council, but that there needs to be some support for groups like ourselves to be able to have sustainability in the long run, because it's no good setting these organizations up and actually they last for a year or they last for 2 years, but ourselves, we're burnt out and we can't do anything because we're actually coping with a lot of personal stuff ourselves. So I think that there is something to be said in when you look at the white organizations who are sustained, who have been doing like putting on cultural events or things like that for years, like they have that support, they have that structure that enables them to do that. We don't have that support, we don't have that structure. And that's the question I actually want to put to the audience, is who's going to support us in doing this work? Because that's what we need. If we're going to talk about allyship, that's what we're talking about, the sustainability long term, not just to be able to have a one-off event here, a panel here. Sustainability long term, that's what we need help in as well. And it is down to the white organizations to open up their power structures and enable that to happen.
Yeah, but I also think as well that I hear everything you're saying, but I'm also thinking about how, as Black and brown led organisations, we're then forced to straddle this line between accepting funding to sustain ourselves, but then working in line with the state. And it's like, but the state harms us. Right, and that's really dangerous for organisations like you and I, Annalisa. Like, you know, it's like, you know, I come from a Muslim community. It's like there is so much funding that comes through via Prevent that's called cohesion work. It's Prevent money. It's money that's there to harm us. Right, this is about surveillance of Muslim communities, and also to make sure that when we talk about, you know, anti-racism and racial justice, we need to be talking about things like Prevent. We need to be talking about anti-Muslim sentiment, because it really is in a par there with a lot of anti-racism, but it's not seen as such, right? So we need to kind of, it's really hard for us. I know organisations that are Black and brown led, and they've taken money from migration funds and cohesion funds, not understanding that the money's come via Prevent. And then they've realised that, and it's too late. And then, of course, there's all the ridiculous funding outcomes and measurements that you have to put in place that mean absolutely nothing. And then there's other things that, you know, getting awarded funding from PCCs and things. We can't accept that funding. We can't accept funding from the police when it's the police that harms us. We can't accept funding from the Home Office because the Home Office harms us, right? And yet we've been pushed into a corner so much that where at one point we were able to receive funding from philanthropist organisations and grant funders. There's just so much because there's sort of processes that happen now, and there's so much competition for that funding, it means that we're not even able to get the funding. So even as Black and Brown led organisations, where we would once be in a bit more of a stable position to be able to get that funding, we no longer are, because white folk has come in and said, do you know what, we're a white led organisation, but we've got a Black worker, so we can work with BAME communities.
Yeah.
So then they get the funding. It's like, that's our funding for us.
But then
You do not understand the work.
I'd also say that on that point as well, that the Black and brown groups that do get that funding are the ones who are willing to, for example, work with the police. I've seen a couple of groups in Sheffield, brown groups, maybe Black, definitely brown, who have worked in collaboration with the police, and so they're getting funding to do their projects. And that's the thing. Like, I'm not going to accept funding from organisations that don't align with anti-racism beliefs, or do you know what I mean, the model. And so I'm not going to accept that funding, and by not accepting that funding, therefore then my organisation won't exist. Do you know what I mean? So it's like this catch-22. It's like, you need the money, but then at the same time you don't want to take money from sources that are complicit. So it's just, it's a mind.
And I think
this isn't anything new. This has been going on for over a decade,
definitely.
right? For very long, and it's got worse. And it feels like, as Black and brown led organisations, we've been pushed into a corner where we're basically being told, this is the only way that you're going to be able to survive. Either you go under, or you accept this funding. So we're put in a position where we have no other choice but to accept it, right? I mean, there was a report that came out a few years back by Incon, which is a Black feminist led organisation, and I think it was something like, in their report, they said that over a period of time, this is during the time of austerity when it first started several years back, that around 60% of BME and Black-led women's organisations had lost funding. 60% of organisations that were around 10 years ago no longer exist. And you just think, but hang on, where's that money going to? Because the money is there. It's going to white-led generic organisations that do not understand the needs of Black and brown communities. So there's something there about commissioning processes as well. Yeah. And that commissioning comes from councils. It kind of feels like everything needs to be scrapped. Everything needs to be, there needs to be a complete alternative system and infrastructure that needs to be put in place for Black and brown people. I don't think Sheffield is willing to even start doing that work, to be honest. I'm not convinced its leaders really are. I think they're saying the right things, but the action doesn't really relate to what's happening.
I think, though, there has been organisations, obviously I'm biased, but I do think that there are a couple of organisations, white organisations, who have done that work, or are trying, or at least attempting to do that work in the last year. I know, like in the VCS, and I've seen that there are more Black and brown organisations being invited, and they shouldn't even be invited, but, you know, invited into various different funding projects. So I do think that there is slight work that is happening, which I have absolute hope for. And that makes me happy to be working in the VCS in some sense, because I do think that there has been a slight bit of change, but I do think it still goes back to the council in terms of the processes and the money and who that money is given to as well.
I think there's something in what you're both saying, which is there's the pull of funding and being at the behest of funding. But I do think that increasingly more and more people are starting to have conversations that are about abolition and how reform is piecemeal and doesn't actually help people long term and doesn't provide the sustainability that you mentioned, Annalisa. So I feel like in some ways this is also the perfect place for us to finish today's chat, because I think at a lot of these type of events, the question will be, well, okay, you've told us what the problem is. What do you think we should do? When actually the problem is what we should do. So, so many of these organizations, in order for that liberation work to be done, we need to know that organizations will not work with the police, will not work with the Home Office, will work to develop their own infrastructure aside from the council, so that there's support for future generations. And I think that's the kind of work that both of you do, to provide spaces for future kids of color who want to do this type of work, who want to be able to do the type of work that the two of you are doing. And I feel like we keep talking about this, but thank you so much to both of you. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your valuable thoughts and your experiences. And thank you for the comments and for the people that have been listening. And I think that's us for now.
Thank you for inviting me on. I've enjoyed it. Sorry for my swearing, everyone. I got a bit passionate there.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks so much, Maryam, and to Joe and everybody from Festival Debate and Now Then magazine. It's been really wonderful. And actually, this is what we mean by creating spaces as well, because these are conversations that Sheffield is very scared of having. So it's great, actually, that there are organisations that are willing to create spaces to start doing this work, because this is the start of it, right?
Yeah, Now Then and Festival of Debate have fully just let us do whatever we wanted to do. We have.
Well, I forgot it was a live show, actually. So I'd love
Hence the swearing.
to both after as well, because I think it's great.